and welcome to the 51%, the show about women reshaping our world. Today we're looking at the role of women in Algeria's independence movement and in the post-colonial construction of a national identity. It's been 60 years since the Évian Accords were signed, putting an official end to a notoriously violent war of independence from France. While the signatures on that document belonged to statesmen from the two countries, women had played a pivotal role in that struggle. To tell us more about women's rights in Algeria then and now, I'm joined by Professor Zahia Smail Salhi of the University of Manchester. Ms. Salhi, thanks for being with us today. Now, if we could, let's start with some of the historical context. Can you set the scene and give us a view of how life was for women in Algeria in the late 50s, early 60s?
Mm-hmm. Yes, women in Algeria who started a feminist movement in the 40s have joint effort with the FLN, the National Liberation Front. Their roles in this war was so pivotal, so important. In fact, there are battles where depended mostly on women, such as the Battle of Algiers, where women played vital roles in the success of this battle and its operations. Women, more than men, were more able to move between European spaces and native people spaces. Sometimes they would wear the veil to enter some spaces and transport arms and messages. And sometimes they would dress like Europeans and enter places where native people were unable to enter. By this time, I think by mid-50s, the FLN recognized the efforts of Algerian women and praised them for their participation in the war.
Well, indeed, in recent years, some of the women involved in the Algerian national resistance have become cult figures, important references for a new generation of feminists. They've also inspired artists and filmmakers, as Natasha Vesnich and Emerald Maxwell report.
Pendant plusieurs années, je me suis tue. Je ne me sentais pas autorisée à parler.
Alice Cherki is one of the thousands of women who took part in Algeria's independence movement. Yet it was decades before her contribution was recognized, something Fatima Sissani set out to do with her documentary, showing how women joined the fight in many different ways.
They were nurses. Some of them hid resistance fighters. They fed them. They were liaison officers. Some of them took up arms as guerrilla fighters or secured arms for others.
Zoulira Bekadour, for her part, helped the National Liberation Front with communications, and no one suspected her.
Obviously, the police were looking for men, and what they found were women, and actually university-educated women. That was the case for me, my sister, and other women. And then there were the European women, like her, who weren't communists. It was one surprise after another.
Working in the shadows, these women risked their lives. Photographer Nadia Maklouf located some of them to take their portraits.
What I realised is that they'd all taken very different paths, but despite that they found each other through their ideals. They wanted to free themselves from the patriarchy that was the coloniser.
By setting these forgotten women side by side with their younger selves, she's created a powerful illustration of past and present to inspire a new generation of Algerian women today.
So we see from that report that those women have been embraced culturally, perhaps, but how much recognition do you think they got from the Algerian state?
I would say the early years of independence were very difficult because while on the one hand, the effort of these women could not be denied, on the other hand, they were denied place in government and in power post-independence. So generally, it is seen that a lot of these women were sent back to their homes, rewarded with smart pensions, and told, that's it, your role is finished now and enjoy a peaceful life. So this has really created a lot of disillusion amongst a lot of the women who fought for independence. But the state quickly hijacked the feminist and the women's issues and put in place a state organization that looked after the affairs of women called UNFA.
Now, speaking of the war, during that conflict in Algeria, some women were subjected to harrowing forms of torture, including rape. Sexual violence was used as a weapon of war by French troops in Algeria. Florence Gaillard and Wassim Cornet report on the scars that ordeal left behind, an issue which for many people is still very difficult to discuss.
Claire Moscopo is a French historian. For years, she traveled to Algeria to speak to the women who lived through the War of Independence. Very few of them broke the taboo of sexual violence.
Les viols pouvaient avoir lieu partout.
Rape could happen anywhere. In hamlets, in remote areas, in jails, inside police stations and military quarters. They could happen anywhere and at any time. And in the overwhelming majority of cases, there were no consequences.
Algerian women did everything they could to escape. When troops neared villages, the women would gather, huddle together with their children. Some would even cover themselves in cow dung to make the soldiers disgusted. But that wasn't always enough.
These women represented Algeria's longing for independence. It's because these women refused to submit that these men were forced to leave France, forced to fight in Algeria. So they wanted revenge. And it's easier to take it out on women than it is on men.
In the early 2000s, this woman spoke out about the abuse she experienced. Here she is back at the former headquarters of the 10th Parachute Division. Louisette Irilahriz describes what happened here when she was arrested in 1957.
They started slapping me and punching me and swearing at me, calling me all sorts of awful things. And then the gentleman crossed another line. You know, I would have preferred other forms of torture. Punches, insults, spitting, electric shock torture. I was expecting all of it, but not rape.
Henri Pouillot was doing his military service when at just 22 he became a secretary at the Villa Soussini in Algiers. At first, he thought being away from the front lines would spare him from the horrors of the war. But he soon discovered the building was a torture center for men and hell on earth for women.
There was a certain number of women who were arrested only to satisfy the sexual desires of soldiers. Women were arrested and taken to rooms where 2 or 3 soldiers slept, and they were raped by each of them.
In 2001, Algerian independence fighters asked him to return to Algiers. That is when he met Louisette Irilahriz, who exposed the sexual violence that happened in the now infamous villa. What surprised him the most was the backlash she experienced in her own country.
Many people made it very clear and in an aggressive manner that she should not have made these public statements about being raped. It's very hard for Algerian women to accept that. They were victims, and instead, some people think that they were actually responsible for what happened to them.
It's been 60 years, but torture and sexual violence during Algeria's War of Independence continues to be a difficult topic to discuss, and one that many would rather sweep under the rug on both sides of the Mediterranean.
Now, we see there some of the taboos surrounding rape, these efforts to silence women when it comes to sexual violence. In your opinion, how effective have those efforts been, and how has that influenced the advance of feminism in Algeria?
Now, after independence and during the War of Independence, there was a pact for women not to speak about sexual torture that they underwent in prisons, in colonial prisons, and the whole society was in agreement that sexual rape and sexual violence should not be disclosed. The reason for that was to safeguard the honor of the women, and also to safeguard the honor of their husbands. And also, obviously, if a woman is known to have been raped, that kind of compromises her future with her husband, in her society, etc., etc. Even now, when I try to speak to some women about the rape and sexual torture they underwent in prison, they are in complete denial. It's something they would rather not speak about.
And moving to the present day, we saw a new generation of Algerian women taking to the streets in 2019 as part of pro-democracy protests there. They were calling for a new social order, more equality as well. Can you tell us a bit about the feminist dimension of those protests? I know there's specifically a part of Algerian law that they're concerned about.
Definitely. In fact, since the establishment of the Algerian Family Code in 1984, Algerian women felt a deep sense of betrayal after they were classed as citizens in post-colonial Algeria. Suddenly, this family code is put in place in order to compromise with the fundamentalists. They have been militating ever since to have this code abrogated altogether, but all they could obtain after 20 years of activism was some timid changes to the law. Well, there are important changes, of course, but still, Algerian women would like to see that code removed altogether, because one way or another, it classifies them as second-class citizens and robs the rights of citizenship from them blatantly. So, of course, the Hirak that started in February 2019 was an opportunity to remind society that women's rights are always central to any democratic movement in Algerian society. And they were present in this Hirak, and they really could make their voices heard again.
Professor Salhi, I'm sorry, that's all we've got time for, but thank you so much for joining us today. Do keep up with us on the 51% on our social media channels. We're on Facebook and Twitter. So until our next show, bye for now.